The humid air of Fort Clay, North Carolina, hung heavy and thick, smelling of pine needles, military-grade soap, and the faint, institutional aroma of boiling potatoes. This was the world of Sergeant Eleanor Ellie Vance, and it was a world that often saw her, but rarely saw her worth. Ellie wasn't built like the glamorous magazine models of the Women's Army Corps WSC advertisements. She was sturdy, with hands calloused from long hours of kneading dough and scrubbing industrial sinks. Her eyes, though tired, held a sharp, observant spark, the kind of spark you only get from knowing your own capability, even when no one else recognizes it. She was the de facto manager of the POW mess hall, a sprawling, echoing space where hundreds of captured German soldiers and, recently, a smaller, deeply guarded contingent of German women ate their mandated, government-issued meals. Ellie took pride in her work. She wasn't just serving slop. She organized the supplies, stretched the rations, and tried, within the strict confines of the Geneva Convention rules, to make the food taste like something more than duty. Her efficiency, however, was invisible to her commanding officer, Major Leland Harding. Harding was a man who saw the war through a haze of paperwork and self-importance. To him, Ellie was just the cook, the gal in the apron, who kept the numbers balanced. He never used her rank, only calling her Vance with a dismissive wave, or sometimes patronizingly, Cookie. Vance, Major Harding boomed one morning, leaning against the doorway, looking far too clean for the steamy kitchen. The new shipment of female prisoners, the high-priority ones, they're complaining again, specifically about the regional offerings. What in the name of Uncle Sam is hush puppy and grits? Ellie wiped her hands on her apron, fighting the familiar surge of frustration. Major, they are standard Southern fare. The supply chain has been short on white flour, so we've increased the cornmeal dishes. It's nutritious, Major. It keeps the men and now the women fed within budget. Nutritious, perhaps, but insulting, I'm told. They believe it's a sign of American backwardness, something about the peasant texture. Fix it, Vance. We don't need diplomatic incidents over dinner rolls. And for heaven's sake, what is that awful yellow block they refused today? Ellie felt her jaw tighten. That yellow block was her cornbread, a perfect, slightly sweet skillet-baked creation that had won every local fair ribbon her grandmother had ever entered. It was a food of warmth, community, and American resilience. That, Major, Ellie said, her voice low but firm, is cornbread. And it is a staple of this country, baked with care. Harding merely chuckled, a dry, grating sound. Well, care or no care, their leader, a rather sharp-tongued woman named Greta, called it a brick of sweet sawdust. Keep it simple, Vance. White bread and potatoes. Save your southern charm for the boys back home. He adjusted his perfectly tied knot and walked away, his polished boots clicking on the tile, leaving Ellie standing amidst the steam. Her skill mocked by the very people she was trying to sustain. The insult stung doubly, first from Harding, who saw her efforts as a trivial annoyance, and second from Greta. This Greta, a tall, severe-looking woman with eyes that held the cold, unyielding pride of a losing nation, represented the absolute pinnacle of their disdain. Greta wasn't just refusing the food. She was refusing Ellie. She was rejecting the humble, hard-won piece of Americana that Ellie had poured her heart into. Ellie knew then this wasn't about rations. This was a silent culinary war of wills, and the first battle had been lost to Greta's sharp, foreign pride. But Ellie Vance wasn't one to surrender her kitchen. The mockery had been delivered, but the fight was far from over. She would make that woman eat her words, one way or another. Major Harding's contempt, though annoying, was simply background noise. The real challenge, the true injustice, came from the stone-cold, unwavering disdain of the German women POWs. Their section of the mess hall was always eerily quiet, a pocket of defiance in the heart of Fort Clay. Leading this silent resistance was Greta. Every day, Greta would inspect the food, not with the hunger of a prisoner, but with the cool scrutiny of a foreign inspector. She never spoke directly to Ellie, addressing her complaints through a translator with perfect, clipped German sentences that always managed to sound like a critique of American culture itself. The rations are adequate. But the preparation suggests a lack of national culinary pride, the translator would drone, while Greta simply stared at Ellie's clean, tired face. The other German women followed Greta's lead, turning their noses up at the cornbread, pushing the yellow squares to the side of their trays. It was a slow daily erosion of Ellie's spirit. She wasn't just cooking. She was trying to build a bridge, a moment of shared humanity over a simple meal, and they were spitting on the cornerstone. One sweltering afternoon, Ellie found a note tacked to her organizational board. It wasn't from Harding, but it had his smell, the odor of stale cologne and bureaucratic malice. It was an inventory memo. All discretionary starch items, cornmeal, oats, sweet potatoes, are to be drastically reduced, effective immediately to save cost. Only standard white flour and Irish potatoes authorized for mass consumption. This was Harding's silent attack. He knew Ellie relied on the cheaper local cornmeal to stretch the meat rations and add flavor. By cutting it, he was forcing her into the very mediocrity he had initially demanded, bland, spiritless food that only fueled the prisoner's complaints and justified his earlier criticisms. He was sabotaging her success to prove his own point. Ellie felt the injustice burn. It was more than a supply cut. It was a personal dismissal of her competence. She sat down at her worn wooden desk, the figures swimming before her eyes. The budget was razor thin. She couldn't order outside ingredients, not without a signature Harding would never give. But Ellie Vance was resourceful. She grew up in the Depression. Waste was a cardinal sin. That evening, under the cloak of darkness and the whirring sound of the noisy extractor fan, Ellie slipped out the back door. She didn't go to the officers' club or the barracks. She walked the half-mile off base, her olive uniform blending into the shadows, heading toward Mrs. Perkins's general store in the tiny, sleepy town of Clay Creek. Mrs. Perkins, a kindly, sharp-eyed woman who knew everyone's business and everyone's needs, was waiting. "Evening, Sergeant Vance. Early for a night delivery, ain't it?" "No delivery, Mrs. Perkins. A shopping trip." "A necessary one?" Ellie pulled out her own pay envelope, the crisp bills earned through weeks of grueling labor. "I need 50 pounds of the best ground cornmeal you have, the stone ground kind, and a gallon of real molasses if you can spare it." "It's personal." Mrs. Perkins didn't pry. She simply nodded. "For the Germans, is it?" "Heard they don't much care for your fancy yellow bread." "They don't, but they will," Ellie vowed, counting out the money. It was nearly a quarter of her month's wages, a significant sacrifice. It was an act of quiet, stubborn defiance. She wasn't just buying cornmeal. She was buying back her pride. She was investing in a better quality, a more authentic version of the dish they had mocked. She was fighting Harding's bureaucracy and Greta's scorn, not with weapons, but with the purest expression of her own culture and skill. She lugged the heavy sacks back to the base, storing them in a deep, dark corner of the pantry, a secret arsenal of golden grit and Southern resolve. The silent war had begun, and Ellie Vance was spending her own money to win it. For the next few days, Ellie moved with renewed purpose. Her secret stash of quality ingredients, the rich stone-ground cornmeal and the dark molasses, sat hidden, a symbol of her personal mission. She kept up the bland menu Major Harding demanded during the day, serving the pale, uninspired white bread that the German women consumed without comment. But her mind was elsewhere, focused on the moment of the challenge. Ellie wasn't just a cook. She was an observer of human nature. She watched Greta during meals. She saw the forced stiffness, the way the German woman's shoulders were permanently braced, the way her gaze often drifted not to the food, but far beyond the wire fence towards an impossible, unreachable home. One afternoon, Ellie found a scrap of paper left near the serving line. It was a crude drawing, done with a burnt matchstick, a sketch of a small, severe, but beautiful house in a snowy, mountainous setting. Beneath it, written in German script, was a single word: Heimat. Ellie didn't speak German, but she understood the word instantly: homeland. It struck her then. The German women weren't insulting her food. They were clinging to their pride. They were soldiers who had been told they were part of a superior culture, a superior nation. The war was over. They were defeated and caged, but the last vestige of their belief system was the absolute rejection of the enemy's way of life, including its food. To accept the cornbread was to admit that the peasant texture they had been taught to scorn was actually good, comforting, and American. It was a surrender. Ellie's initial anger softened into a deeper, more complicated resolve. She wasn't trying to break them. She was trying to feed them, soul and stomach. She needed to make a dish that was so undeniably, fundamentally good, so steeped in its own honest pride, that it would bypass the propaganda and speak directly to the human need for comfort. She decided to bake the cornbread, not the Army's stiff, regulation version, but her grandmother's recipe, the one that wasn't written down, but passed through the feel of the batter and the sound of the sizzle. The secret ingredient wasn't molasses, or even the stone-ground cornmeal. It was the cast-iron skillet. Ellie had salvaged a massive 20-pound iron skillet from a defunct post kitchen. It was decades old, perfectly seasoned, black as coal and smooth as river rock. This skillet, she knew, was the key. It distributed heat evenly, creating the ideal, crispy, caramelized bottom crust, the part of cornbread that whispered of home and hearth. She waited until Major Harding was on a 2-day inspection trip to a neighboring base. On that first quiet morning, Ellie mixed her dough. She used her purchased cornmeal, buttermilk begged from Mrs. Perkins, a hint of honey she'd been saving for holiday baking, and a careful measure of bacon grease rendered from the morning's leftovers to coat the skillet. She heated the iron until it was smoking hot, then poured the thick golden batter right into the shimmering heat. The sound was a glorious, immediate sizzle, a promise of a crust so perfect it could withstand any mockery. The aroma that filled the mess hall that day was unlike the usual institutional steam. It was warm, sweet, and comforting, a smell that spoke of kitchens, of mothers, of slow Sunday mornings. It was the smell of unapologetic Southern Americana. Ellie knew the smell alone would draw attention, but she wasn't hiding it anymore. When the cornbread emerged, baked to a deep burnished gold, sliced into perfect squares, the aroma hung in the air like an invitation. This wasn't a ration. This was a statement. This was Ellie Vance, the underestimated cook, staking her claim not on the battlefield, but on the simple, powerful truth of good food. She placed the squares on the serving line, ready for the prisoner's lunch. The confrontation she had been avoiding was now inevitable, and she waited, heart pounding, for Greta to arrive. Lunchtime at the POW mess hall was usually a mechanical, joyless affair. But that day the air was different. Even the American guards seemed distracted by the unusual aroma, that deep, sweet, almost smoky scent of true skillet-baked cornbread. When the group of German women marched in, their eyes, typically focused straight ahead, darted towards the serving line. Greta, walking with her usual stiff-backed posture, noticed the difference immediately. Gone were the pale, dry blocks of yesterday. In their place sat squares of deep amber gold, the edges slightly uneven and dark, promising a crunchy crust. Greta paused directly in front of Ellie at the serving station. The line of women behind her stopped, watching the silent, dramatic standoff between the German leader and the American cook. "And what is this?" Greta said in flawless English, surprising the translator. Her voice was cold, polished, and sharp as ice. "A new attempt at American cuisine? It looks greasy. Still yellow." Ellie met her gaze, unflinching. "It is cornbread, Greta, made from a 70-year-old family recipe. It is what we eat in this country when we want comfort." Greta let out a small, contemptuous laugh. "Comfort? We were told by our officers, by our command, that this yellow food, this maisbrot, was the food of the enemy's uneducated masses, a sign of their reliance on simple, inferior grain. It is a symbol of their weak character. You cannot defeat a strong nation with this." She gestured dismissively at the warm, steaming square. The other women murmured in German, their faces reflecting Greta's disdain. They were soldiers, fighting a war, even here. They wouldn't betray their loyalty for a piece of bread. "It's a mistake to judge a whole nation by a rumor or by what your officers told you to think," Ellie replied calmly. "You judge it by the taste. Greta's eyes narrowed. But Ellie noticed a flicker. Perhaps hunger, perhaps curiosity, perhaps just the exhaustion of holding up a crumbling world of pride. "If I eat this comfort food?" Greta challenged, picking up the piece with the tips of her fingers as if it might contaminate her. "And it is, as you say, sawdust. Will you admit your food, your culture, and your victory are simple?" "No," Ellie said firmly. "I will admit nothing. I will only say that if you eat it, you will have the truth. And the truth needs no admission." The silence in the mess hall was total. Every American guard, every tired prisoner, was watching this battle waged over a piece of bread. Greta stared at the cornbread, then back at Ellie. She raised the piece to her mouth, her expression one of utter distaste, making a show of her reluctance. Then, without further comment, she took a bite. It wasn't a tentative nibble. It was a full, clean bite, breaking through the crisp, buttery bottom crust into the moist, almost cake-like interior. For a moment, nothing happened. Greta chewed, her eyes still locked on Ellie. The soldiers held their breath, and then, the change. It wasn't a dramatic gasp or a moan of delight. It was a subtle, involuntary slackening of her shoulders. The tension that had been locked in her jaw for months seemed to ease. Her eyes, still cold, now held a deep, astonished surprise. Her expression softened, just for a second, into something close to remembrance. She didn't look at the food. She looked through it, tasting something she hadn't tasted in a long time: care. She took a slow, deliberate second bite. Her political pride was fighting a losing battle against a primal human need for warmth and flavor. Finally, Greta lowered the remaining piece of cornbread. She didn't apologize, didn't praise, and didn't even look at Ellie. Instead, she turned to the woman behind her and said, in a low, gravelly German, "Take one, and tell the others it is different." It was the highest form of surrender. The other German women, having seen the crack in their leader's armor, hesitantly stepped forward. The line moved. As they reached the counter, their hands, which had so confidently pushed the food aside before, now reached out, grasping the warm, golden squares. The mockery had vanished, replaced by a silent, shared moment of surprised consumption. The cornbread had passed the test, and in doing so had opened the door to a truth deeper than any battle line. The silent consumption of the cornbread changed the atmosphere in the mess hall forever. It wasn't instant friendship, but the icy wall of disdain had fractured. The German women no longer saw Ellie Vance as the enemy cook. They saw the woman who had delivered a single, undeniable piece of comfort. 2 days later, Ellie was restocking the coffee urns when Greta approached the counter. She was alone. "Sergeant Vance," Greta said, her English still precise but without the biting edge of mockery. "The bread. It was good. Why?" Ellie leaned against the counter. "Because I made it right. Not from a military standard, but from a family one. It was honest food." Greta sighed, a heavy, tired sound that seemed to carry the weight of her entire defeated nation. "We were taught to hate it," she admitted, her voice low. "The propaganda said your country was weak, sloppy, without discipline or history. Your food, especially the yellow cornbread, was described as the coarse, primitive diet of farmers, proof of your lack of sophistication." She paused, turning the memory over in her mind. To eat it and like it, it would have meant everything we fought for was based on a lie. "And what does it mean now?" Ellie asked gently. "It means," Greta looked down at her hands, which were surprisingly soft, "that you, the cook, are not sloppy. You have discipline, and you make your own kind of comfort." Ellie felt a deep connection with the woman, a fellow soldier on a different side. Both fighting for something. Greta for her national pride, Ellie for her personal integrity. Ellie decided to share her own truth, the source of her fierce dedication. "I didn't join the WAC to cook," Ellie confessed. "I joined because my older brother, Jimmy, he was a bomber pilot. Shot down over the Ruhr Valley 3 years ago. Never found the body." Her voice cracked slightly, but she steadied it. "I cook, Greta, because when I make good food, honest food, I feel like I'm taking care of my soldiers. All of them, even the ones who wore a different uniform. I want them to have one good moment, one taste that says, You are still a human being and you are being looked after. Greta was silent, taking in the sacrifice, the deep personal wound behind the mess hall schedule. I am sorry for your brother, she finally said. It was the first genuine piece of empathy Ellie had received from the women. The shared moment bonded them, not as friends, but as survivors who understood the cost of war. This subtle change in respect gave Ellie the leverage she needed to fight her internal enemy, Major Harding. Ellie had been quietly keeping her own set of books. She knew the supply reduction in Part 2 was not just about saving cost. She noticed that the actual food shipments delivered to Fort Clay were larger than the amounts Harding was recording on the official manifests. She tracked the discrepancies: missing beef, surplus sugar being signed off as used, and a recurring delivery truck that arrived late at night, leaving with full crates before dawn. Harding wasn't just incompetent, he was corrupt. He was diverting valuable rationed food, the food Ellie was supposed to be using to feed her prisoners, and selling it on the local black market. That's why he cut her cornmeal. It was the one thing he couldn't easily steal and resell. He wanted her to fail with bland food so he could cover his tracks. Ellie had her evidence: 2 weeks of discrepancies, photos taken with a borrowed camera of the mysterious nighttime truck, and a signed receipt from a local civilian she'd befriended, detailing a purchase of black market sugar sourced from the base. She had earned Greta's respect with honesty and cornbread. Now she would use that human connection to deliver justice. She prepared to confront Harding not with anger but with facts, armed with the knowledge that the people she fed, even the German prisoners, were now her silent witnesses. Ellie waited until Major Harding returned from his inspection tour. She didn't seek a private meeting, which he could easily dismiss. Instead, she found him in the administrative building lobby, just as he was holding court with 2 visiting officers from Washington, D.C., men who carried the weight of wartime accountability. Harding was basking in their praise. "Yes, gentlemen, Fort Clay is running like a Swiss watch," he was boasting, puffing out his chest. "We've contained costs, morale is stable, and the kitchen staff, well, I've had to tighten the reins on them. Too much unauthorized experimentation with local cuisine. Keeps the system messy, you see." Ellie walked directly into the conversation, her movements measured and slow. She carried a thick ledger, her personal books, and the small stack of photographic prints. Begging the Major's pardon, "Sir," Ellie said, her voice clear and strong, cutting through the Major's self-important drone. The visiting officers turned to look at her. "I believe there are a few discrepancies in the inventory report that need your immediate attention, and perhaps the attention of the Washington officials." Major Harding's face went pale, instantly recognizing the gravity of the situation. "Vance, this is highly irregular. Get back to the mess hall. I'll see you later." "With all due respect, Major," Ellie continued, ignoring his command, "this can't wait. The issue is about the food, sir. Specifically, the food we are not serving, and where it's going." She turned to the visiting officers. "Gentlemen, Major Harding's official inventory logs show a significant reduction in our available meat and sugar rations over the last month, citing wastage. My personal records, based on actual deliveries and consumption, show a surplus that never reached the mess hall." She opened the ledger, pointing to the columns. "The difference, sirs, is enough to feed the entire POW camp, both sections, for a full week. I also have photographic evidence of a non-military vehicle making unauthorized supply pickups late at night, right after Major Harding signed off on a delivery of 10 crates of beef." Harding exploded. "This is slander. Insubordination. She's a disgruntled cook, gentlemen. I warned you about her unauthorized methods." "My methods," Ellie countered, her eyes blazing with determined fire, "were to spend my own wages to buy higher quality stone-ground cornmeal when the Major cut my basic starch allocation." "Why did he cut the cornmeal, sirs?" "Because cornmeal is hard to resell on the black market. Beef and sugar are not." Just then, the outer mess hall door opened. Greta and 4 other German women, having heard the commotion and anticipating the confrontation, stood watching. They were supposed to be locked down, but Greta, a master of military organization, had found a way to be nearby. One of the Washington officers, a stern-faced colonel, looked at Greta and the other German women. "Major Harding, what are those prisoners doing out of their barracks?" Harding stammered, I have no idea, Colonel." "They're rebellious, sir." Greta stepped forward, addressing the colonel, speaking loudly enough for everyone to hear. "Colonel, we were told by our officers that Americans were weak. Sergeant Vance has shown us otherwise. She sacrifices for us. The Major, however, steals the food meant for us. He is a thief of rations and he is a bad soldier. She is a good one." Greta's impromptu testimony, a German POW defending an American cook, was the final devastating blow. The colonel, witnessing the blatant corruption and the extraordinary level of respect earned by the young sergeant, shut his ledger with a loud snap. "Major Harding," the colonel said, his voice flat with official contempt, "you are relieved of your duties, effective immediately. Sergeant Vance, you are to secure all files and personnel immediately." Harding, utterly defeated, stood frozen, his self-important world crumbling around him. Ellie watched him being escorted away. The redemption wasn't revenge, but the pure, powerful exposure of truth. She hadn't fought him with a gun or a command. She had fought him with integrity and a simple, honest recipe. That evening, the mess hall was quiet again, but the silence was different. As Ellie served the cornbread, now a permanent beloved staple, to both the American and German soldiers, she noticed Greta give her a slight, almost imperceptible nod of respect. It wasn't about the food anymore. It was about the strength of character, the power of a quiet sacrifice, and the sweet, satisfying taste of justice finally served.